The saying goes that nothing is certain except death, taxes, and dust in your film scans. But my goal with today's video is to give you a precision tool in your toolbox that'll help make that dust thing not quite so much of a problem. Suppose it's as easy as just drawing a circle around the dust spot and pressing a button to delete it. I'll show you how I did that, how to create your own actions to make it that simple, and give you a few tips and tricks that'll help you with your workflows. So stick around. Dust in your film scans is just one of those things that no matter how diligent you are or how clean your space is, it's just always there. It just seems like you can never be totally rid of dust particles. So it's just kind of an inherent thing that we have to deal with, especially those of us who work with analog films and scan and post-process digitally. Currently, I use an Epson Perfection V850 flatbed scanner with Silverfast 9 software, and I can already hear some out there yelling at their screens. Why not just use the built-in ISRD dust removal during scanning? And that's a fair question. First off, those infrared dust removal methods don't work on black and white negatives, so you still have to process those differently. And there is another tool that can help you with that inside of Silverfast. But more than that, I don't personally like the results I get from Silverfast doing this particular task. But there are a number of methods out there to get rid of dust in your scans. And I'm not going to say that this method I'm about to teach you is the only way to do it or even the fastest method. But it is one that I use in my workflow a lot. And it's a little more tedious than a lot of the automated methods you might see out there. But I certainly think the results are better, in my own opinion, that is. Most often, the best results for cleaning up a given file will come from choosing the best tool for each task individually, and then combining all the techniques you learned together into an overall workflow that produces great results. If you follow Nick Carver on YouTube, he just did a video not too long ago, a couple months ago, about some of those more automated methods for doing dust removal. If you haven't seen that video already, I highly suggest that you do watch it, after this one, of course. This video is going to be more of a deeper dive into one concept for tackling object removal, but it's basically a quick way to make a very precise selection and use a content-aware fill tool, which in my opinion is far superior to a lot of the other dust and scratch removal tools. You won't need any fancy panels or extensions. All of this uses the built-in tools that everyone already has access to, but it is limited to Photoshop. So if you work exclusively in Lightroom or any other software, it won't be much help to you since I'm a Photoshop kind of guy. You may also have noticed by me fiddling with this pen in my hand that I like to use a Wacom tablet to do a lot of my editing. I just find it, especially when I'm trying to make a lot of selections, this is just a whole lot easier than trying to do that with the trackpad. But the essence of this is just making a selection. So if you prefer to use a mouse or something else, that's perfectly fine. So without further delay, let's get into Photoshop and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now I'm on a Mac, so my modifier keys you'll see popping up in the corner, and my screen layout may look different to you if you're on Windows. We should have all the same menu options available to you. The first thing I like to do is duplicate the background layer by hitting Command-J, and I'll rename this as Cleaned Up. So I'm working non-destructively here on a separate layer so that anytime I can always go back to the original image. That's important because I don't want to get way into this an hour later and realize I screwed up the image really bad and not have a way to go back. Now on a color scan of a sheet of E6 color reversal film, the dust is most commonly going to show up as a dark spot, kind of like this one. And that's because it's blocking the light going into the imaging head of the scanner. And that's kind of the whole principle that makes this technique work. In this case, we have a light background with a dust spot that shows up dark against that. Now, this would be a pretty easy job for just about any of the tools in Photoshop. So if I come over here and grab the spot healing brush over here on the tools panel, or you can hit J as a shortcut and just draw right over the top of that. That does a pretty good job of removing that. That's pretty easy for just about any of the tools. I would be happy with that. Let's take a little closer look at the settings of this tool. So in the top menu bar up here, I've got the tool I have selected, the brush size, my mode, which is normal, and then next to that is type, and the currently selected default is content aware. Now, I'm not an Adobe developer, so I don't have intimate knowledge of the workings of this tool, but my understanding is that content aware uses the pixels around a given selection to try to best determine what it can fill that with in order to create a seamless replacement. So this tool is essentially just a brush tool that has that functionality built into it. And you could arguably do your entire image with this tool. I could drive around here and just click all of these dust spots and remove everything. The problem with that is it's kind of tedious. But depending on the file you're working on, if it doesn't need a lot of cleanup, it's just a few quick jobs, that might be enough. And that would be plenty, and I'd be happy with that. But what you'll run into in some scenarios, especially with like a gradient sky, you'll end up with just a nightmare scenario of dust that you have to clean up, and going in there and clicking all that is really, really time consuming and tedious. And my goal today is to try to avoid having to go click every single dust spot. So let's look at another option. I'll undo this and start all over from scratch. The first thing we need to do is make a selection. Select around the piece of dust we want to remove. And you can do that with a couple different tools in Photoshop, but for this example, let's start with the lasso tool, which is L on the keyboard. This tool just basically gives you the ability to make a freeform selection around an object. The next step is to go to the Select menu and hit Color Range. Now, I don't know what's going to show up here by default on your screen if you've never been in this menu before. You may be showing sample colors or something like that. But if you click this drop-down menu, down here you'll see highlights, midtones, and shadows. Now, because what we're trying to remove is dark on a lighter background as opposed to a light object on a dark background, what we want to select is dark tones. So I'm going to choose the shadows here. Just below that, we have a fuzziness slider. You can see by my tooltip here, it says adjust to fall off beyond the tonal range. So some sort of feathering going on here between what is selected and what isn't, and where that threshold of that tonal value is. 5% seems to work really well for me here, so I just leave it there. Below that is a range slider. 0 is total black, and 255 is total white. Underneath that is a preview window of what is currently selected. And if you click the image button, it gives you a pixel preview of the actual image, the area that you have selected. But you don't actually have to click this radio button to toggle views. You can just hit the command button on Mac or control on PC, and it'll toggle between the mask view and the actual pixel preview, so you can see what it is you're trying to select. But what we're interested in the most here is this range slider here. We want to get this to where we have a good selection of the object. You can see if I move this up a little bit, I start to get a pretty good, well-defined shape of the object that I have that I'm interested in trying to remove. You don't want to move this so far up that you start getting noise and other stuff in the background like this. This is not restrictive enough of a selection. You want to bring it down a little bit since it's shadows. But if you go too far, you start to lose some of the other detail inside of the object. So you want to get this at a good balance to where you have a good selection of the object we're trying to remove. And if you're not sure if you have it all, that's when you toggle the other view to make sure you can kind of reality check here and make sure the thing you're trying to select is actually selected. But this looks pretty good as a selection, so let's hit OK. You'll see that the marching ants have shrunk down now to cover just the object that I'm interested in. And if we wanted to, from here, we could just go straight to the Edit menu and click Fill. And that brings up this dialog. A shortcut for that, by the way, is Shift-Delete. It brings up the same menu. I don't know what yours will say when you first open this, but if you hit this drop-down box, you'll see Content Aware. This is using that same algorithm that Spot Healing Brush was using that was doing such a good job before. So what this is going to do when we hit OK is it's going to look around the pixels that we have selected and try to figure out the best thing that it can fill it with to make it look seamless. So let's hit OK and then Command D to deselect. And what you can see is it's removed the object, but it's left this halo looking thing. We can still see that there was an object there, and it's kind of strange looking. So let's back this up and undo until we have our selection again. The issue is that our selection is too restrictive, and it's not providing enough information. So what we need to do is expand the selection just a little bit to give the algorithm a better idea of where the edges are around the object that we want it to remove. So instead of going directly to the Fill menu, what I'm going to do instead is go back up here to Select, then Modify, and Expand. You can play around with this value a bit depending on whatever it is you're trying to select and how it's working for you, but I tend to find that about 10 pixels usually seems to work well. You can try 5, 15, whatever works best for your situation. Let's hit OK. So up to this point, we made a really loose selection and then restricted down really precise, and now we've expanded it just a little bit to give it room to breathe. Now if we hit Shift-Delete, Content Aware Fill, and Command D to deselect, now that looks pixel perfect to me. Let's try that in another spot and review what we did. Let's tackle this one. L for lasso, draw a loose selection, select, color range, shadows, adjust the range slider, get this little corner out of there a little bit. Hit OK. Select, modify, expand by 10 pixels, Shift-Delete, Content Aware Fill, deselect. That looks perfect to me. And that's the general overall concept, but we're not done here because that's too many steps. So let's take a look at how we can speed this up and make it a little more efficient. The first thing we can do is to record this into an action that will perform all of these steps for us. I apologize if you're already familiar with Photoshop actions, but for those that are new, I'll quickly walk through how to create them. I'm going to delete the layer that we've been working on and so I can start from scratch. The first thing we need to do is go make a selection again. Now you can get to your actions pane by going to Window actions. And you can see I've got mine snapped over here in my workspace, so I have quick access to it. Now I've got a few folders shown here because I've made actions for a number of different tasks, but you may only have the default actions here, and that's okay because we're going to start from scratch. At the bottom of this window, you'll see a little folder icon here that says Create New Set. I like to organize by folder, and this is how you do that. So I'm going to create a new folder and call it Dustbusters, but you can name it whatever you like. Now that I've got a new folder or action set created, I'm going to go down here and hit this plus icon, which is Create New Action. This dialog will pop up, and I'm going to name this one Remove Black Dust. The action set that it will belong to is Dustbusters, which is a folder we just created. And then I'm going to hit Record. Now you'll notice there's this little red icon down here telling you it's going to record whatever it is you're about to do. So now let's go through all of our steps that we did before. Go up here to Select, Color Range. And I'll adjust my range slider until I have a good selection. That looks pretty good. Hit OK. Then I'll go back to Select, Modify, Expand by 10 pixels. Shift-Delete, Content-Aware Fill. Command-D to deselect. Now go back to this Actions menu, and you'll see that it's still recording even though it was hidden. So hit Stop. Now that we recorded all those steps, let's go see what we've got. So I go find another dust spot. Grab my lasso tool, draw a selection around it, go to my Actions panel, and I want to grab the name of the action that we just created, not one of the individual steps underneath it. So you can collapse this if you want. Just grab the name and hit the play icon, and it plays your action. Let's find another spot. So this one, draw a selection, hit play, gone. This one, play our action, gone. One issue though is if we go around to a dust spot that isn't quite as dark and hit our shortcut, we'll get this error. It says Command Expand is not currently available. That's because we need to go into our color range selection tool and adjust this range slider because the selection we had active was not enough pixels for the next step to be processed correctly. So you're going to have to adjust the slider based on whatever it is that you're trying to select at the time. So what we need to do is go back to our action and find that color range step that it recorded. And on the left-hand side of that, there's this little square. If we click that, this box icon shows up. The description shows toggle dialog on and off. What will happen now is if we go select another dust spot and run our action, now it pauses and brings up that selection box for us, giving us a chance to adjust the range slider to whatever is appropriate for this current selection. So I'm happy with that, and I'll press OK. Now our action plays on. So in this way, now we can just drive around our image and just select things and wipe them out really fast and accurately. So that's black dust. Now let's try a different example from a color negative scan, this one from Colorado. Now, of course, on color negative or black and white film, if you're working on the inverted image like I am here, instead of the orange mask version, those dust particles are going to show up white instead of black. So that means we have to adjust our tools a little bit in order to handle this situation. So again, I'll create a selection around the piece of dust. I'll go back up to my Actions panel. And in the same set as before, I'm going to create a new action. This time I'm going to call it Remove White Dust. And I'll press Record. So let's go through the same steps. Go to Select, Color Range. But in this case, I don't want shadows anymore. I want to change this to highlights. Make sure that makes a pretty good selection, which it looks pretty good already. Hit OK. Then I'll go to Select, Modify, Expand by 10 pixels, Shift-Delete, Content-Aware, Command-D to deselect. Then I'll go back up to my Actions, hit Stop Recording, and then of course we want our newly created action to also show this dialog box when we get to the color range step, so I'll press this button to show that as well. And now we can zip around here and make selections of white dust. Choose the white dust action, adjust our slider, OK. Now we can zip around and remove white dust. So notice in this image I have white and black. So now I can flip back and forth, and I can remove the black dust as well, since I have both options. But we can make this even better. Another thing you can do with actions is assign it a keyboard shortcut to trigger it. So we go back to our actions panel. I'm going to rearrange these a little bit. You hit this hamburger icon and go to Action Options. Brings up this menu again, and you'll see down here there's a function key option. This allows you to map a shortcut to your action using one of the function row keys. I like to set my white dust action to F1 and the black dust to F2. You also have the option to use this in combination with the Shift or Command modifier keys. Just to avoid conflicts with other shortcuts, I like to use Command as a modifier, so Command F1 or Command F2 will trigger my actions. And hit OK. Now I'll go back to my Remove Black Dust shortcut, go to Action Options, map this to F2, along with Command modifier, hit OK. You can see on the right here in my Actions panel, it shows that these shortcuts are mapped to these hotkeys. Now without having to click anything, I can just go quickly draw selections around things and hit my shortcut keys I just mapped, fire my actions, quickly remove light or dark spots needed, making it really quick and easy to do a pixel-perfect job of cleaning up the image. But we're still not done. You might be asking yourself, what's the difference between what we're doing here and just using the spot healing brush? So up to this point, I could just hit the J key and just run around hitting everything with a spot healing brush, which seems a lot faster than recording a bunch of silly actions with complicated steps. And that's fine. And sometimes I'll do just that if I'm just trying to knock a couple things out real quick. But the actions we just recorded here are a lot more accurate way of selecting things instead of just drawing over it with the spot healing brush. Depending on the image you're working on, you'll often find that the actions do a better job of minimizing the amount of pixels that get replaced and manipulated. And in addition to that, the more precise your selection is before you use that content aware fill tool, the better the algorithm will understand what exactly it is you're trying to remove and what should remain. And in my opinion, it results in a more transparent and targeted fix. But the real power of what I just taught you is that you can use these actions we created with any selection. Let's look at another example and we'll switch to the marquee tool in the tools panel. Now I currently have the elliptical marquee tool selected, but underneath this tool, there's some other options. You have the rectangular, elliptical, single row, and single column options. The rectangular and the elliptical are the ones I think are the most useful for this task. I'm going to stick with elliptical. You can use the selection tool of your choice, but I often like to use the marquee tool for this because I can just make quick selections like this and just draw quick circles instead of having to draw all the way around an object with the lasso tool. But of course, that's always an option if you need to freeform draw some complex shape or something. But the point is, I can still make my selections with whatever tool I want, and I can still use my same actions to remove all that dust. But we can still kick this up a notch and make it even more powerful by working on a whole area at once. Let's find a spot that needs a lot of work. In an area like this where there's really good uniformity in the background, and there's good separation between that and the dust particles, we can actually select the whole thing and run our action. And in this case, I can get a pretty good selection of just those dust particles and hit OK. That does a pretty good job. Now and then, you can get away with that, especially on something that like a gradient sky or anything that's uniform in tone. But this technique usually works best when you make multiple smaller targeted selections of objects with similar tone. So let's look at how to do that. If I go over here to the sky of this image, find a spot that's got a bunch of dust particles in it, grab my marquee tool, and I'll just make one big selection over all of this and hit my shortcut. You see, it's hard for me to get, to find a spot to put this slider to where I can get all the dust spots I want to remove without selecting the highlights of the clouds I want to keep. And that's because the highlights of the clouds are too similar in tone to the dust spots I'm trying to remove in the darker areas. But on any of the selection tools in Photoshop, you'll see at the top menu bar over here, you'll see a couple little boxy looking shapes up here. By default, the new selection one is active. The next to that is add to selection, then subtract from selection, and finally intersect with selection. Using these different modes, you can create complex selections in Photoshop to fit whatever it is that you're trying to grab. You don't have to come up here to click these. You can actually use your modifier keys. If you make an active selection here, press and hold the Shift key. You'll see my cursor gets a little plus sign next to it, switches modes in the top menu bar. Now if I hold Shift and go select something else, it will add to the current selection and lets me select multiple things. But if you select too much and you want to remove something from the active selection, press and hold Option or Alt, and you'll see I get a minus sign. So anything that you select here will be removed from the active selection. This works with the marquee tool, with the lasso tool, and as far as I'm aware, it will work with any of the selection tools in Photoshop. So now if I use this technique to select all the things I want to remove, and then hit my shortcut keys, what we're seeing in the preview now is a frame around all the individual selections we made. Just like we made one big selection with the rectangular marquee tool, but that's not what's going to be affected here. It just doesn't have any other way to display all the multiple selections you made. So we need to set the range slider to make sure that all of our little individual selections are covered, but we don't necessarily need to worry about the things that aren't part of the individual selections. You'll see what I mean here in a second. So if hit OK, that did a really good job of removing it. But now if I undo to see what it actually selected, you can see it didn't select the entire thing with all the highlights, in between my selections. It only restricted my individual selections down. So that did exactly what I wanted. Let's grab another example. I just multi-select all of these whites, run my shortcut, hit OK, and done. Let's try a few more examples. So hopefully now you can see how this technique can start to become really powerful once you get comfortable making multiple loose selections around a bunch of things and wiping them out all at once. And if you add in all the other tools you know how to use, the spot healing brush, the clone stamp tool, the filters and techniques that Nick Carver teaches in his video, and combine them as needed to achieve your goal, you'll be totally unstoppable. Now, even though the theme of this video is dust removal, you aren't limited to just that with these tools. Say you've got a stick in a river, like this one, and you want to remove it. As long as you have good tonal separation, can get a good selection of it with the color range tool, you can use this tool to remove that as well. And I'll show you one more example that's a little more advanced where you can use this. If I go back to this image from Colorado, way down here in the corner, you can see there's this blue streaking going on down here. What this is a scratch. So some of the coating layers of the film have been damaged and the blue cyan layer is showing through. That's what I think happened. But we can use the color range tool to make a selection of this and remove it as well. Let's grab the marquee tool, make a selection of this, and I'll run my shortcut again. Now instead of tones, I'm going to switch the select dropdown to sample colors. I'm going to change my fuzziness up here to about 30%. Now you'll see that my tool has been changed to an eyedropper. So if I go over here and try to get a good sample of this blue color, it's kind of a starting point, and kind of get an outline of it there. And just like all the other selection tools, you can add to your current selection by holding Shift. You can see that plus icon comes back. And now I can select all the other tones of blue around here until I get all the other range of blues in this object. You can see in the preview window here, I've got a really good, nice masking of those blue parts now and not the other things around it. So let's hit OK. And that does a really convincing job of getting rid of that scratch. So as you can see, it doesn't even have to be just black or white tones. You can use this technique on any color as well, as long as you have good separation and can get a good selection of it with the color range tool. This technique can work. So I encourage you to feel free to experiment and see how this color range tool can be useful to you in your workflow. So just for fun, maybe I'll finish up cleaning this image just so you can see how I would do this for real. And I'll speed up the video so you don't have to sit through and watch it in real time. So here we go. So now that I'm done with that process and I've got all the dust out of the image that I want gone, I'm happy with results, I don't want to go through this again. So I would flatten the image at this point and save it as my new source file from my scanner. I wouldn't make any big changes to objects or distractions I want to remove at this point, or make any edits. This part of the process is just to clean up the scan so that my starting file, basically like my raw file, is in a good place for further editing. So now only one thing remains. Now that I've shown you the tools in my process for how I do this, we get to the more philosophical discussion, which is, should you clean your images this much? I think everyone has to answer that for themselves, and I'm not here to judge or to be judged. I'm only showing you what's available to you, and then you get to decide what is too much or not enough for your images. I know some artists will leave all of this stuff in here and clean absolutely none of it. They'll do the best job they can cleaning the film before scanning them in, and then that is what the image is. It's part of the character of the image at that point. Others will take more surgical approaches and clean every little single imperfection until it's absolutely perfect. Both approaches are equally valid, and whether or not you want all those blemishes and defects in there as character, or if you want something that's super clean like a digital file, we each get to decide for ourselves where that line is drawn. Personally, for the majority of my images, I don't want to draw attention to the medium itself. I want the image and what it has to say to be the focus of the viewer's attention and let it stand on its own without those distractions. Especially with the prospect of printing really big, those defects are going to be mighty big as well. And if you use sketchy technique to remove them, it's more likely it'll show in print. By the way, hopefully there was at least something in here that you learned that you can use in your own workflow. Or if nothing else, I hope it was at least entertaining. And if it was, hit that thumbs up button down below. And then let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this kind of tutorial style video, or if you have any suggestions for things that you'd like me to do a tutorial on. I'd be more than happy to take a look at those and see what I can do. Also, for my Patreon supporters, you guys get my actions for free. So check the Patreon page for a link where you can download my actions so you don't have to make your own, as a small thank you for your support. They'll come with a short tutorial on how to install them if you're not already familiar with how to do that. And if you're not already a patron, there's a link down in the description below to the Patreon page if you'd also like to have access to those instead of making your own. But that's all for now. So thanks for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.